I think it's fair to say I won't be visiting the woods again, if that's the name for the area of trees that look eerie at night, wedged between a few neighborhoods in my town. The kids call it the woods. Parents call it off limits. But you know how kids are. Once they hear the words, "No, don't go in there," they get that adrenaline going and start planning their adventures to the Forbidden Lands. I was one of those kids. I was your average 14-year-old kid who accompanied a few younger than me. Oliver was the youngest. He had the smarts of a 5th grade reader in a 9-year-old body. The twins, Charlie and Madison, were the second youngest, always arguing who gets to go first on things because one was minutes older than the other. Jackson was a year younger than I was, but acted like the headman of our little group. We were all friends since preschool and have lived in the same neighborhood since diapers. It was the last day of school for the summer. The sun was out in a clear blue sky, and it was hotter than the year before. We all got out of our grade classes, yelling and screaming in excitement that summer break was upon us. We all met at the bus stop, like always, and gave each other high fives and laughs. Jackson was the last one to get to the group with a big scowl on his face. He had a piece of paper in his hand and sat down on the bench. "What's eating you?" Charlie asked. He was usually the one poking his nose into people's business before we all joined in on the questions. Jackson lifted up his paper and sighed. "My teacher gave me a note from my parents because I'd backtalked again. I am doomed this summer," he said. His parents would surely ground him for who knows how long, and the beginning of the summer break was not the best time. I pat Jackson on the back and sighed dramatically. When will you ever learn?" I said in the most sarcastic tone I could manage. Jackson just looked up at me like he was going to throw a punch. I just grinned. The bus finally rolled up and we all climbed in for the half-hour drive to the neighborhood. Our town was pretty small. We had to drive to the next town over to go to school and to go shopping for everything. I mean, we had a small general store, but that only had minimal essentials that a family needs to survive. I always asked my parents why we didn't move to the bigger town when we always had to drive there. My dad would always say how happy we were in our house and that it was better there. I stopped asking after a while because that was his answer for everything. Because we are happy here. I put my earbuds in and turned on my little iPod. I got it for my 14th birthday last year for getting good grades. I turned it on to my favorite song and put it on repeat. Barely a minute into the song, Jackson pulled one of my earbuds out and looked at me with a "I have an idea" grin, which is usually never good. "I have a plan," he said and bounced in his seat. "Let's go on an adventure. Once my parents see my teacher's note, I'm done for. So before that happens, let's go." He lowered his voice for only us to hear. "Into the woods," he finished. I turned off my music. "Are you nuts? We aren't allowed in there. It's off limits," Madison chimed in. Charlie nodded in agreement. Oliver kept quiet and looked at everyone. He wasn't much of a talker unless asked a question. Jackson kept his big grin on his face. "Oh, come on. Don't wuss out. It's summer break and I will be on lockdown forever. Let's do something fun," he said. He would get himself into trouble every chance he got. His temper wouldn't let anything slide. He was grounded a lot. We all stared at each other. The only sound was the engine of the old school bus chugging down the back road that led to our neighborhood the fastest. Clouds of dust masked the view behind us from the dirt road. I finally broke the tension. "So what's your plan?" I asked. I was a little interested in how we could play this out. Everyone looked at me in shock, but Jackson's smile grew wider. "I am so glad you asked. We go camping in the twins' treehouse," he said excitedly. "We'll keep Rufus busy and sneak off when all the lights go out," he said. Rufus was the twins' German shepherd. He kept watch of the treehouse when we all spent the night in the backyard. Best guard dog I have ever met. The school bus pulled up to the bus stop beside our neighborhood street. We all thanked the driver and hopped off. Our plan was to get home and ask to have a celebratory sleepover in the twins' treehouse to begin the summer break. All parents call each other and talk it out, Once we all get the okay, we eat dinner and pack up our stuff for the night out. My parents weren't super strict about me going outside or play or go to sleepovers. Every year they got a little more lenient the older I got. It was always a perk because I was rarely grounded. It was always, she's growing up, mistakes are part of growing up, blah 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 blah, and so on. After dinner, I ran upstairs to pack my backpack for the sleepover. It didn't take long for my parents to come up and give me the speech about safety and splinters from the treehouse. You are older than everyone. Be a leader and take care of your friends, my mother said. I nodded while stuffing a few comic books and clothes into my backpack. I grabbed my flashlight last and held it while swinging my pack onto my back. I looked up at my parents and both of their faces were stern and straight. Now remember where you aren't allowed to go. That place is off limits, my dad said. He says the same thing every time. I nodded my head again like a routine and walked past them out of my room. They followed me to the front door and watched me run across the street to the twins' house. I waved behind me and disappeared through their backyard gate. The twins were already up in the treehouse, playing music and getting the sleeping bags ready. I climbed up, gave the password, and headed inside. The treehouse was pretty large. The twins' parents built it a few years ago after Madison kept climbing to the top of the tree and stayed there for hours every other day. It was her favorite thing to do. Charlie soon followed her example and stayed in the tree with her. Their parents decided on building a big treehouse for them, and it turned into a weekend sleepover tradition for all of us. Charlie pulled open a bag of chips and started munching. Madison got onto him for eating so much right after dinner. Oliver showed up in his Buzz Lightyear pajamas and begged not to be made fun of. He was going to change before Jackson showed up. After a couple of hours, Jackson finally appeared. He had a mix of anger and relief on his face. He climbed into the treehouse without the password and sat on one of the sleeping bags, giving a big sigh. After this, I am in the slammer, he said. Parents are letting this be my final meal, he went on and laughed. He was always a fan of police shows and acted like he was on death row every time he got into trouble. What a weird kid. We all hung out and read comics until midnight came around. We looked outside and it was pitch black. The moon was barely visible through the clouds that rolled in earlier that evening. Charlie looked around and left the treehouse to check on his parents. He came back moments later with his thumbs up that it was all clear. He put Rufus in the shed with his food and water and closed him in. After a couple of barks, he went quiet. This was our chance for our summer adventure. We all quietly, one by one, climbed down the treehouse ladder, each of us carrying our flashlights. We snuck across the backyard and climbed onto Rufus's doghouse. It was tall enough to hop over the fence. We didn't use the gate because it would have been too loud to close. Once we were all over the fence, we looked each other over and headed through the first few trees into the woods. In my eyes, the woods always gave off this eerie vibe that had me in uncomfortable chills when I looked outside from home. But tonight it felt different. Maybe because we were actually in the woods instead of staring into its darkness from our bedroom windows. We trudged through the dead leaves and grass, shining our flashlights every which way, just checking the place out. Nothing really stood out to us. Every other tree looked the same, and the only sounds being made were the crunching of our feet in the leaves. None of us spoke for a good while. It seemed like the woods were calming us rather than let our curiosity to its own search for something exciting. A good hour or so had passed and nothing interesting was coming up. Oliver would pick up a leaf or a rock and explain what he had learned about in school. Jackson was ahead of us, marching along and looking around. Charlie and Madison walked side by side, whispering to each other in hushed tones. Must have been a twin thing. I hung back a bit so I had a full view of everyone. Being the oldest, I felt responsible for everyone like they were my brothers and sister. I guess my parents constantly repeating that I was their protector and leader started to sink in at some point. After a little more silence and solo thoughts, Jackson piped up all excited. "Hey, there's something over there," he said and started running. "Wait! Jackson, wait for us!" I called out and we all ran after him. Not many yards ahead, there was what looked like a big old shed. It reminded me of the shed they have at school where they keep the tractors and other machines. This one, however, was falling apart and rusty. The green paint was chipped and revealing the old age of the small building. We walked around it and shined our flashlight on debris around the area. Metal pipes, pieces of the roof of the shed, trash, and all that. It was all abandoned. It was abandoned and old. How exciting is that? Didn't stop Jackson from getting to the door. He checked the door and saw no locks were keeping it shut. He took the handle and pulled it open. Almost immediately, the door creaked and fell off its hinges onto the ground. The rust was so bad that the framing was rotting away. Jackson grinned and walked right in. I sighed and looked at the others. They decided to stay outside and keep watch if anyone showed up. Charlie chose to follow with me inside behind Jackson. We shined our lights around inside of the shed. It smelled like coins and stale old clothes, reminding me of my grandparents' closet I would hide in when I played hide and seek with my cousins on Thanksgiving last year. They had a giant jar of quarters they collected for a rainy day. I would always play with them like I was a grocery store clerk collecting coins for purchases. Those smells were all too familiar in this old place. Jackson brought me back to reality when he moved a big piece of metal. It looked like the front of a car out of the way to make a path into the rest of the shed. "Help me move stuff around. I bet we'll find something for keeps," he said. I shook my head. "I think I'll pass for now, thanks." Charlie chimed in and flashed his light on Jackson to help keep an eye on him. I looked around more to get a clear view of everything. There was metal everywhere. Car doors propped up against one wall, another wall was covered in rusty tools with wooden handles. A front end of a car was by the doorway of the shed. I looked over to one of the back corners to see a ruffled up blue sleeping bag and a few empty food cans. My thoughts were, maybe a homeless man lived here? I used to see sleeping bags and cans under overpasses on the freeway. Once Charlie got a glimpse of that corner, he headed out of the place. "Something doesn't feel right," he said. "I want to go home. I'm heading back." He finished and walked around the shed to tell the others. All I could hear was a crunching of leaves fade out as Charlie disappeared through the trees. "He's a scaredy cat anyway," Jackson said, still rummaging through debris. I didn't respond. Jackson thought we were all weaker than him and called us weenies at least once in every situation we put ourselves in. I shined my light around the room again, then back at the corner where the sleeping bag was. Something caught my attention. I thought I saw a man. Well, the shadow of a man. A black shadow with what looked like a hat on his head. I shined my light away and gasped. Jackson stood up straight and looked at me. "What, you find something?" he said. I shined my light back into the corner to find nothing there but the empty cans and sleeping bag. I shook my head no to Jackson, and he shrugged and went back to snooping. Was I just seeing things? Maybe it was just Jackson's shadow and I was letting my nerves get the best of me. I turned my back to look at stuff around the doorway. Jackson moved to the corner and kicked a few empty cans out of the way. Then he picked up the sleeping bag and tossed it behind him. "Oh wow, look at this. It's a big hole," he said and shone his light at me. I turned and looked into the flashlight, shielding my eyes. "Get that thing out of my face. I'll go blind." "What's in the hole?" I asked. Within a few seconds, I could hear a noise, like bugs running around on top of each other and making tiny squeaking noises as if they talked to each other. Jackson moved his flashlight back down to the hole to reveal it was overflowing with centipedes. Jackson jumped back and cursed for the first time. You know that creepy crawling feeling you get when there's a bunch of insects in a pile moving around at once, and that clicking sound of their bodies rubbing together? Those were the millions of centipedes now crawling all over the ground of the shed. More and more erupting from the hole in the ground. Jackson stepped as far back as he could before running into the debris he had moved over before. The centipedes were fast and heading right for him. They started to latch onto his shoes and work their way up his jeans. He screamed and started brushing them off, but more of them climbed on. The worn holes in his jeans were the entryway to his skin. One bug after another made its way into his pants. Others climbed up the back of his legs and up into his shirt until they got up his neck. They began to bite him. He continued to scream, and all I could do was stand there and awestruck and watch. Pretty soon the centipedes covered Jackson's entire body and began injuring him through his mouth, ears, and nose. His screams were muffled out and he fell into the ground face first and shaking. Eventually he stopped moving. He stopped screaming. The copious amounts of centipedes continued to crawl all over his body and start chewing. You could hear the mandibles of those insects tearing and chew on Jackson's flesh. At this point, I was shaken back into my right mind by Madison. She looked horrified at Jackson's body being devoured. I took the light away from the scene and pushed her and Oliver out and away from the shed. "We need to go. We need to get help," I said, and grabbed Oliver's hand and began to run. We ran through the trees towards what we thought was the way back. We kept pushing and running until we found ourselves out of breath. And back at the old shed. I shook my head and began running again in the opposite direction. My lungs were on fire, but I couldn't stop for anything. My mind kept replaying Jackson's death with each passing tree we ran by. Once we were at our limit, we stopped to catch our breath again. But when I looked ahead a few yards, the shed was there. We were at this for a few hours, running in all directions only to come back to the old, rusty, beat-up shed. I wanted to fall on my knees and scream. Madison sat up against one of the trees, and Oliver sat with me in sheer terror of what was happening. I shone my light over to Madison to check on her, and from behind the tree, the shadow of the man with the hat was peering over. I took a deep breath into the double take, like before, and nothing was there. Madison then yelled at me to move the flashlight from her eyes. We sat like this for a couple more hours. The morning sun began to rise through the trees of the woods. Madison and I stood up and brushed the soil and leaves from our clothes. We were exhausted and on the verge of tears. I picked up Oliver onto my back to let him fall asleep. No 9-year-old should have to witness what we saw that night. We made a final decision on a direction and started walking. Moments later, we could see the treehouse in the distance. Tears of relief escaped my eyes. It was all over. It has been a month and a half since the police retrieved what was left of Jackson's body. They found him the day after we went out there. The state of his body looked like he had been decaying for weeks. Charlie never made it home that night, and they still haven't found his body. Madison locked herself away in her room and refuses to talk to anyone. I feel we are no longer friends. Oliver's parents decided to pack everything up and move far away. They said Oliver was too young and could start fresh somewhere else away from this town. I get letters from him every once in a while because he wants to practice his handwriting. And that leaves me. I've been going to therapy sessions to talk about what happened. I don't like talking about it, but I did talk about the shadow man with the hat. The doctor told me about an urban legend called the Hat Man. He was an old man that lived in the shed in the woods, collecting car parts to sell and collect centipedes in empty cans to keep him company. The centipedes would feed on the rusty metal and turned carnal. They killed and ate the man in the hat that basically raised them. They ate all of him, even his bones. If they didn't get Jackson when they did, there would have been nothing left to find. Maybe the ghost of the Hat Man haunts those woods. Maybe he took Charlie. My parents have grounded me to my room for however long they see fit. I've decided that I don't want to leave my house anymore. The incident ruined me. I can't go back out there. I get chills. I get chills every time I look out my window. I've asked my parents if we could move away after the incident like Oliver's parents did. They would just say no. We're happy here. I've given up on them already. After dinner tonight, I went up to my room and shut the door. I sat down at my desk that faced my window. I turned my lamp on and peered outside. The glow of the full moon lit up the trees and bushes of the outer woods. I think it's fair to say I won't be visiting the woods again.